All right, it is great to be here, and today, as you know, I am talking about a very difficult subject, which is the problem of evil. And I'm going to do three different things in this message today. The first thing I'm going to do is I want to actually understand what this problem actually is. What is this problem of evil that we hear so much about, and how can we actually formulate it into an argument against the existence of God? So that's part one. Part two is we're going to look at some responses to the problem of evil, as I'll lay it out in the first section. And then third, we're going to look at a problem of evil for atheists. I think that there is actually a good argument against atheism from evil. And that one is going to be really interesting, so definitely stay tuned to the very end. And that's actually like a YouTube thing. Stay tuned to the very end of the video. I was about to say that, but I'm too much into the YouTube world. All right, so first I want to issue a trigger warning as we get into this first section. So we're going to look at some very specific cases of suffering, and these involve small children. So if you would like to leave the room now, if you don't want to hear about any particular case, it's not going to be that bad, but I just wanted to issue the trigger warning. So if anyone would like to leave at this point, that's the time to leave. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I think that we have an obligation to face reality. That's the first reason. The second reason why we're looking at some specific cases is because it's actually going to help us understand what this problem is. So let's look at the first case. And this one, we've got a statistic, which is 38. According to the National Safety Council, America's leading nonprofit safety advocate, 38 children under the age of 15 die per year from heat stroke after being left in hot cars. Has anyone experienced this or had a close family member or friend who's experienced something this tragic? Well, it happens. There's a specific case that we're going to look at. His name is Juan Rodriguez, the father of one-year-old twins. He pleaded guilty in court for the deaths of his two children. Quote, the defendant, Juan Rodriguez, left his one-year-old twins in the backseat of his car for 8 hours while he went to work. Bronx District Attorney Darcel Clark said, the children were strapped in their car seats throughout the hot summer day with no windows open. He told police he dropped off his 4-year-old son Tristan at a Westchester daycare, but forgot that his twins were in the rear-facing car seats. He said he returned to the car 8 hours later and started to drive away, according to police. He drove for 2 blocks before discovering the children, foaming at the mouth and lifeless. Now, this is an example of suffering brought about by free choice or human choice, and that's going to be important a little bit later on. So this is the first example, a really terrible example. Here's another terrible example of suffering. The next figure is 227,898. 227,898. The 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami, also known as the Boxing Day tsunami, killed an estimated 227,898 people in 14 different countries, making it one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded history. And actually, I have a video that we're going to see of the tsunami coming in. There's a father and his kids. They're playing on the beach in Malaysia when the tsunami waves start to come in. Now, quick warning, the audio in this clip is not very good. It's kind of distorted. So I've warned the guys in the back, so just plug your ears if it's a little bit too loud. But let's go ahead and play the video. So I have two very small children. I don't know how I would react in a situation like that. It's horrible. But again, I think that we have an obligation to face reality. And then this is also going to help us really understand what this problem of evil actually is. And I think Christians, we don't have a choice. We have to take this problem of evil and suffering very, very seriously. So scientists investigating the damage of the Boxing Day tsunami found evidence that the tsunami waves reached a height of 80 feet when coming ashore along large stretches of coastline and rose to 100 feet in some areas when traveling inland. Now, this is an example of suffering brought about not by human choice, but by nature. And so we actually have a distinction that we can make here. This is going to help us develop and actually think about responses to the problem of evil. There's moral evil on the one hand and natural evil on the other. So there's two kinds of suffering. Moral evil is suffering brought about by the free choices of humans, like in the heat stroke case. And natural evil is suffering brought about by nature, like in the tsunami case. And so when we're looking for responses to this problem, we want responses that are going to address both types of suffering. Now, another distinction that's going to be helpful here is the practical versus the theoretical problems of evil. Daniel Howard Snyder, he's a Christian philosopher, he puts it this way. He says, the practical problem is about maintaining or restoring one's relationship with God in light of the suffering one is enduring. The theoretical problem of evil is about whether evil and suffering is good reason to think that God does not exist. In the practical problem, we're experiencing the reality of suffering and our relationship with God is strained as a result. However, in the theoretical problem, we basically just want to know if some philosophical argument succeeds or not. So one is experiential and one is philosophical. And so today we're going to focus on the philosophical problem of evil. Does suffering provide a good reason to think that God does not exist? So the first way that this has been, or one of the ways that this has been articulated by atheists, is by a guy named David Hume. And he puts the problem of evil like this. He says, is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able, but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then from whence comes evil? You can tell he's kind of older with the whence. But what I want you to notice in this articulation of the problem of evil is that it's a question. But questions are not arguments. And this is something I point out on my YouTube channel a lot. Asking why God allows suffering is not an argument that God doesn't exist. And questions are just that. They're questions. They're trying to get information. Arguments, on the other hand, they assert informations. So questions get information, arguments assert information. Now, why is this even important? The problem of evil is often presented as a question. Why does God allow evil? But even if you don't know the answer to that question, it doesn't follow that God does not exist. It could be the case that God exists and has reasons for permitting suffering, but you just don't know what those reasons are. So questions are good, but they're different from arguments. And here's an appropriate response to someone that is asking this type of question about suffering. You know what? Actually, I don't know the answer to that. Like that is the answer that you could give to someone who is asking a question in the form of a question, the problem of evil. So another thing to keep in mind is that the problem of evil is a very emotional subject. Questions about suffering can be very emotional. I mean, the clips that we just watched, the story about the father, this is a very emotional subject. And so when you ask a question about suffering, it can just be very emotional. And what happens, if we're not careful, is emotional questions can actually make us think with our hearts instead of with our brains. In a similar way, advertisers use your emotions against you. So let's watch a following clip from Chevy Motors.
lots of light. I don't understand. Did I do something wrong? Are you breaking up with me?
Slow and steady.
Trans, the official sudden vanticles. This is Maddie.
Chevy. It had nothing to do with Chevy, did it? Yeah. So Chevy, notice in this commercial, they didn't set up like why their cars are better than the other cars. They didn't argue that Chevy gets better gas mileage, that they're safer. What they want you to do is they want you to skip over all that stuff. They don't want you to think and reason and stop and slow down and actually think about what's going on. They want you to skip directly to the conclusion, I need to buy this car. And I think that's similar what's going on when you get an emotional question about evil, is that it can bypass your reasoning and it can make you jump to a conclusion that doesn't actually follow. But what we want to do is we want to be guided by the truth. We don't want to be guided by our emotions. So now let's turn from an articulation of the problem of evil that's based in a question. Let's now turn to one that's actually posed as an argument, because arguments from evil have been made. So this one comes from a guy named William Rowe. He's an atheist philosopher, and he gives an argument that can be summarized like this. Premise 1, if God exists, there is no pointless suffering. Premise 2, there is pointless suffering. And the conclusion just straightforwardly follows, so God does not exist. Now, this is actually a valid argument, and what I mean by that is that if both premises are true, if God exists, there is no pointless suffering, premise 1. Premise 2, there is pointless suffering. If those two premises, those two steps of the argument are true, then the conclusion that God does not exist actually is also true. And so what we want to do is we want to question whether or not these two premises are true. And the premise that I'm going to focus on, Christians actually have objected to that first premise. They think that God's existence is actually compatible with pointless suffering. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at that second premise. There is pointless suffering. Is it actually true that suffering is pointless? So what I'm going to do is we're going into section 2, where we're looking at 3 different reasons why God might have to allow suffering. So a couple quick caveats before we get started into these different reasons is that these reasons should not be taken in isolation. Rather, these 3 reasons should be taken together. And I'll reiterate that as we go along. And then also, the 3 reasons that I'm covering today should not be thought of as exhaustive. There are other reasons that Christians have brought up and that Christians discuss in the literature on the problem of evil, but the 3 that I'm going to discuss are some of the most prominent reasons. So the first reason is free will. Free will. Now, free will is actually kind of difficult to define, but it's basically the idea that we aren't robots. We're not robots. We make our own choices. So, for example, I was free to come and speak with you this morning. It was within my power to refrain from coming on stage and speaking. So here are 2 positive aspects of free will. Has anyone seen the movie Aladdin? It should be everybody. It should be everybody. So at one point in the movie Aladdin goes up to the genie, and the genie's like, hey, look, there are some things I just can't do. Even though he's all-powerful, he can't make people fall in love. And so the ability to love, and this is just like the movie shows that this is a really common belief among people, is that you can't force people to fall in love. You have to actually love someone freely. And so free will actually makes the possibility of love possible. The second positive aspect of free will is that it makes self-determination possible. There's a guy who I quoted earlier, Daniel Howard Snyder. I'm going to quote him again. He's awesome. You got to look him up. For one to be self-determined is for one to be free to a significant degree with respect to the sort of person one becomes. Lacking such freedom, we could not be deeply responsible for who we are, who we will become, and whether we will manifest and confirm our character through the choices that we make. Now, how this relates to suffering is that if we are free to love others and to self-determine our character, then we're also free to be unloving. We're also free to hurt people. We're free to leave children in hot cars. But the idea here is that free will is so valuable that it makes the possibility of harm worth it. So here's a quick analogy. Getting my kids vaccinated with a needle is going to hurt them temporarily, but being vaccinated is so valuable that it makes the suffering worth it. And that's kind of the idea behind free will, is that free will makes any kind of suffering that is the result of free will, it makes it worth it. Now, that being said, there are some negative aspects of free will that kind of put a question mark on this reason. The first one is that too much freedom is actually a bad thing. So my son is 4 years old. His name is Hendrix. If I were to give him the freedom to wield a kitchen knife, that would be bad on my part. I would be giving him too much freedom. And so there's kind of this question of like, did God give us too much freedom? Do we have too much free will that we can use to hurt other people? So that's just one question mark on this reason. Another question mark is that free will doesn't actually account for natural evil. Remember that distinction I made earlier between moral evil and natural evil. Suffering as a result of nature, free will doesn't really account for it. So we've got to turn to other reasons. The next reason is called natural law. Natural law. Let's go ahead and put up the picture of the house and the fire. To reason and make free choices, the world has to be predictable. We have to be able to predict the consequences of our actions. I need to know if lighting a match in a house could result in it burning to the ground. To be truly responsible for our actions, we must be able to weigh the consequences of our actions. And that requires a world that is orderly, a world that operates according to natural laws. Now, I think the best way to really see this reason in its full strength is to imagine a world of chaos. The guy I quoted earlier, Daniel Howard Snyder, I'm going to quote him again. He says, "Suppose I chose to give you a flower and a big hug to express my affection. But my limbs behaved so erratically that it was just as likely that my choice could result in what I intended as that I would poke you in the eye and crush your ribs." Then he says, the very laws of momentum that enable you to give and receive flowers will also cause a falling boulder to crush you if you happen to be under it. And then finally he says, in general, the sources of natural evil, which afflict non-human animals and us, disease, sickness, disasters, birth defects, and the like, are all the outworking of the natural system of which we are a part. We can go ahead. Oh, there we go. Already got it up. You guys are staying on top of it. According to June Korenega, a geophysicist at Yale University, without plate tectonics, Earth could become hot and inhospitable, a hot and inhospitable world just like Venus. But plate tectonics can also cause tsunamis that kill hundreds of thousands of people. So this is kind of the idea behind this natural law reason. Now, here's the question with natural law. Does natural law actually do enough? Does it provide a good reason why parents lost their children in the Boxing Day tsunami? And that's just something you can think about on your own. Some days I think that it is enough, some days I don't think that it's enough, but just think about it on your own. Just like in the free will example, too much free will is a bad thing. But perhaps in the case of too much regularity, there could be too much regularity, too much order in the world. So maybe God should intervene in the cases of huge tsunamis that are going to kill hundreds of thousands of people. So let's now turn to my favorite reason, which is called soul building. Soul building. And the name of this one is actually, it'd probably be better if the name of this was changed to something like virtue acting. Virtue acting. This reason basically says that acts of virtue like love, forgiveness, compassion, sacrifice, these are worth the suffering in the world. Acts of virtue are the greatest possible goods. And just think about it for a moment. Can you think of something that is greater than these acts of love, like forgiveness, like compassion? And notice, suffering is actually necessary to do these acts of virtue. It's necessary. Has anyone seen the movie Endgame in here? It's probably going to be mainly young people. Endgame. So this is a movie where a guy named Tony Stark, he sacrificed himself for who knows how many people, billions of people. He sacrificed himself. He endured quite a bit of suffering. The point, though, is that acting out virtue literally entails or requires suffering. We're about to turn to a video. In the video we're about to watch, we're going to witness one of the greatest acts of virtue that anyone can ever do. And this always gives me chills every time I watch this. It's a movie, or not a movie, it's a clip about radical forgiveness. Let's watch.
An emotional courtroom as the victim's father took the stand, his impact statement offering a lesson in forgiveness.
I blame the devil, who misguiding you and misleading you to do such a horrible crime. No, I don't blame you. I'm not angry at you at all.
Relford was sentenced to 31 years for his role in the killing of Salahuddin Jitmood. Officials say Relford came up with a plan to rob the pizza delivery driver. Jitmood was stabbed to death at an apartment on Trent Circle in April of 2015.
I forgive you on behalf of Salahuddin and his mother on the act of involving to kill him.
The judge, also overcome with emotion, called for a recess, only to return to another heartfelt statement, this time from the suspect himself.
Just tell them I need to. Well, I thank you for your forgiveness.
There was only uncontrollable sobbing as Relford and Jitmood's father embraced one another, proving that sometimes kindness does prevail. Covering the news in Lexington, Lindsay Piercy, LEX 18 News.
Every time I watch this clip, I just want to stop and just think about how awesome that is. It's so valuable, these acts of love like this. Let's now turn and talk about what the Bible has to say about virtue. In Romans 5:3-4, it says this: "We rejoice in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance, character, and character, hope." The Bible says we're literally supposed to rejoice in our sufferings because suffering produces character. It produces hope. Now, despite the reasons that we've covered so far, it could be the case that some cases of suffering nevertheless remain utterly mysterious. And in these cases, I think it's actually best to exercise humility. Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga, that's a guy you definitely need to look up if you've never heard of him. Alvin Plantinga, planting like planting a tree and then just an A on the end. He says it like this: "Given that God is omniscient, and given our very substantial limitations, it isn't at all surprising that his reasons for some of what he does or permits completely escapes us." All right, let's put the picture of Magnus Carlsen on the screen. Is there anyone in here who knows who this guy is? It's difficult to see hands with the lighting, but nobody. Okay. All right, so he's a Norwegian chess grandmaster. He's the reigning 5-time world chess champion. But if you're not into chess at all, some of the moves that a grandmaster is going to make might seem kind of puzzling to you. It might seem kind of weird. But does the fact that you don't know why they made their last moves, does that mean that they couldn't possibly have a reason for making that move? No. Exercise some humility and acknowledge that you don't know everything. Isaiah 55:8-9. "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts higher than your thoughts." Now, while I personally think that the reasons that I covered can actually account for any case of suffering, it wouldn't be surprising that some cases of suffering have justifying reasons that are just far beyond our ability to understand. And after all, God's ways, as we see in Isaiah, God's ways are far higher than our ways. His intellect is infinitely greater than our own. When it comes to the problem of evil, we should be ready to exercise some humility. All right, the last section. Let's move on to the last section. We'll move through this one pretty quickly. Is there a problem of evil for atheists? I think the answer is yes, and it's probably going to be in a form that you haven't seen before. So we are optimists. Most people are optimistic about the world, including atheists. And by an optimist, I mean something very, very specific. An optimist believes the world is overall good and that we should be happy and grateful that we live in it. An optimist believes the world is overall good and that we should be happy and grateful that we live in it. Here's a quote from a famous atheist, Richard Dawkins. He says, quote, "We have cause to give thanks for our highly improbable existence and the law-like evolutionary processes that gave rise to it. Such gratitude is not owed to or to be directed towards anyone or anything." Nevertheless, he does have this sort of optimistic take on the world. Now, the question is this: how can one maintain optimism in the face of so much suffering in the world? Given the three reasons that I outlined just now, theists, or people that believe in God, are in a much better position to maintain optimism than atheists. If God exists, not only is there a loving being at the foundation of all reality, every case of suffering serves some greater purpose. But what can an atheist actually appeal to? Can they appeal to greater purposes? No. On atheism, all that exists is material reality. They got nothing. They got nothing. And so theists are in a much better position to maintain optimism than their atheist counterparts. And I will close now with a quote from my favorite, or one of my favorite philosophers, Richard Swinburne. It is important what an agent does. It is more important what an agent does than what happens to him.